And we're back with our political panel. Julie Pace is the White House correspondent for the Associated Press. Ed O'Keefe covers politics for the Washington Post. We're also joined by CBS News political analyst and Slate's Jamelle Bouie and Ramesh Ponnuru, senior editor of the National Review. Julie, I want to start with you. This week saw Donald Trump give his most sustained public comments that were restrained. The word presidential was used a lot. Then Saturday, a series of tweets that seemed the opposite of that. Where are we now going into Monday with the Trump presidency?
It was incredible whiplash this week. I think we have to give the president credit for the speech that he gave on Tuesday night. It was a side of him that we don't often see. It was restrained. It was traditional. He got into some of the agenda that he wants to see going forward, but it just quickly gets overtaken, in some cases because of actions by people like Jeff Sessions, who didn't totally be upfront with the congressional committee when he was doing his confirmation hearings. But then it's the president himself who goes out on Saturday and distracts with these series of tweets. And the overarching problem for him is he's going into a week that is going to be policy heavy, a new rollout of the vetting EO, and then a rollout of healthcare. And the success or failure of healthcare is going to be one of the measures by which his entire presidency is judged on. And to distract from that, to not go into this week with a sense of focus, I think really hampers his administration.
Ramesh, on that point, one of the things that made Republicans happy about this speech was that it was focused. The president hit the marks of a speech like that, which is important when you've got to sell a piece of legislation. Now the worry is back to distraction.
I think there was a very short-lived sigh of relief that came from Capitol Hill Republicans about the president. But I think there's a connection between what we saw on Tuesday night with the president's speech and what we saw on Saturday morning with these tweets, which was the president thought he had hit a home run with the speech. He was getting great positive reviews. And then reportedly, he was furious that the story moved on to Attorney General Sessions' misleading testimony in Congress. And that's what apparently set him in this mood where he sets these tweets. Now, one other thing about these tweets that I think really is remarkable is he's alleging explicitly a Nixon-Watergate level conspiracy on the part of the previous administration against his own presidency. And then he starts commenting about The Apprentice within the same hour. I mean, this is just a remarkable set of things, and it makes you wonder how seriously you can take the things that he's saying.
And that was also after a speech in which on Tuesday night he said there's no more time for trivial fights, and The Apprentice would be probably in the trivial category. Jamelle, question for you is, when the president takes to Twitter, it's often as a strategic move to distract from one thing and move to another. Do you see strategy in what was happening yesterday?
I see some strategy in that he wants to kind of regain the attention of the media, the attention of everyone from the Sessions controversy. I think we should not overstate the degree of strategy here. We've seen over the years, over the last 24 months, that Trump is impulsive, that Trump is very self-involved, you might say. And so this could also just well be Trump lashing out as Trump does. I want to say one quick thing about last Tuesday's speech, that while it was relatively more calm and serious and mature than most of Trump's addresses to the public, it should be said that some of the policy content there was just as extreme and just as aggressive as we've seen in his less stable moments. Stable might be the wrong word, but in those moments. So, for example, in that speech, he announced the creation of an office dedicated to publicizing crimes committed by undocumented immigrants, which has two problems. The first, that it presumes that undocumented immigrants are responsible for a huge number of crimes, and the second is that it is stigmatizing. It contributes to an atmosphere where people are doing harm to immigrants. And Trump's tone shouldn't distract from that.
Ed, picking up on what Jamelle said, the president talked about unity, but if you're trying to unify with Democrats and yet doing things of what Jamelle just described, they're not going to be in a mood to unify.
Not at all. And they weren't, they fled the chamber as fast as they could Tuesday night, having essentially held their nose throughout the whole thing. And they have said, look, we see no reason to work with him. He has made no real attempt to make any, overtures to us. Why should we bother? And I think the fact now, even today, we're seeing the Senate Minority Leader on another program raise doubts about the Republican leader of the Intelligence Committee, now shows you to what extent this really spreads. It spreads all the way now into the even into the investigation into Russia. There is no appetite up there among Democrats to cooperate with this president because they're convinced that he's just so tarnished, and they see no political benefit. Whether that works for them ultimately remains to be seen, but I think it's a real testament to the poisonous nature and the fact that he has done nothing so far, at least in their view, to fix things.
Mark Warner working very hard to to keep support there for his chairman, Richard Burr, and in his comments. Julie, I want to ask you about the substance of President Trump's Russia policy, because there's a lot of talk about Russia and connections and all of that. But what's happening with respect to actual U.S. policy towards Russia and the president's position on that?
So this is really an interesting conversation that's happening in the White House against the backdrop of all of these revelations about people meeting with the Russian ambassador. The president came into office talking about striking a deal with Russia. It hasn't quite been defined, but the broad buckets include cooperation on the Islamic State, Ukraine, some kind of negotiations over arms control. And I'm told that he's been sending signals both to his advisors and to allies that this may not be the right moment for that kind of deal. There are a couple reasons why. One is that the White House is very concerned legitimately about some treaty violations that Russia has had involving a cruise missile launch a few weeks ago. But there are other factors. You have some new voices in the room with the president who are tougher on Russia than he has been and some of his previous advisors have been. You have European allies that are learning to speak the language of Trump, talking to him about a deal. You don't want to make a bad deal with Russia. You don't want to make a weak deal with Russia. So it's interesting that they're picking up on those cues. And frankly, it just underscores the political climate right now for him. To have a president moving forward on a robust deal with Russia against all of these questions about his relationship, I think even he and his advisors are realizing that that would be pretty difficult to strike that kind of deal in this climate.
Ramesh, let me switch to Obamacare here from Russia and ask, where do you think things are as the House leaders begin their process and as the White House sort of comes along with them? What's the state of play with respect to replacing Obamacare in Congress and the White House?
I think there's considerable confusion and disagreement still among Republicans. I think that the congressional Republican leadership has its own basic sense of where it wants to go. It wants to have a tax credit-driven strategy that provides coverage to a lot of people, even in a post-Obamacare world. But there's a significant number of conservatives in Congress who don't want any part of that, and the administration is not being entirely clear about where it stands on this basic divide among Republicans. Normally, congressional Republicans in charge of Congress with a Republican president would be looking to the administration to set their direction on this kind of issue. This time they're not, or at least that direction is not being provided.
Fascinating piece of context today by our friend Paul Kane in the Post. He said more than 160 House Republicans have never worked before with a Republican president. They're used to blocking and tackling. They're not used to running with the ball. And we are seeing this every day up there. Amid all the other noise about Russia and whatever the president is tweeting about or doing and saying, they do not know how to deal with this issue, and they're going to have real trouble. To hear the secretary here now dodging your questions about the specifics of what this outline will look like, they're allegedly working off of his blueprint that he wrote as a congressman. And even that isn't able to generate enough agreement. If you have as many as 40 House Republicans, and they're out there concerned about this, wanting to stand in its way because they don't think it's conservative enough or costs too much money, that's the end of the game. There will not be health care reform if they can't get it out of the House and if they can't find Democrats to work with them, and they don't want to.
Well, the Democrats definitely don't want to work with them.
Oh, absolutely not. It's almost a perfect storm of dysfunction for the effort to get to repeal the Affordable Care Act, because you have Congress people who have not worked with the Republican president, have very little experience with this kind of legislation. You have a White House that is arguably in disarray, or at least does not have the kind of experience that you need to shepherd major pieces of legislation through Congress. You have a president whose stated goals for reform are run kind of counter to what congressional Republicans say they want. And then, of course, you have Democrats who have just decided largely to say, hey, we'll let you take care of this and we're not really going to help out. There's a timer here, too, right, that as time goes on, this just becomes more and more difficult. And
it's a political matter.
Right, it's a political matter. And so we may actually already be approaching the point politically where there isn't that much to do, because it's just opposition's building, voters are speaking out, and the opposition and Democrats are really rallying their side against it.
Julie, one thing I heard from Secretary Price when I asked him about Medicare is he said the promise of Medicare will be there.
Right.
When Donald Trump was a candidate, no tinkering, no how.
Absolutely.
Promise is different. Promise is you can get a whole different kind of thing. The promise is there, but the form of it is different.
And the president in the campaign said that over and over and over again. That will come back to haunt him if an eventual package does make changes there. I mean, I think what's so interesting about this moment that we're entering is Trump is now going to have to really be a president who gets involved in legislation if he wants to get this through. You have lawmakers on the Hill who want to hear from him. They want him to pick up the phone and give him a call. We don't know if he's capable of doing that. This is going to be a big test for him as a president.
Ramesh, and the president, the reason Paul Ryan wants flexibility on Medicare is to find some money to pay for all the other things that President Trump wants to do.
That's right. I think that this point Julie made about the president's involvement and its possible effect on the Hill is a really important one, because it's right what Ed's saying. If 40 conservative Republicans are holdouts, you can't pass anything. But will they stay holdouts if at some point President Trump is saying, I need you to replace Obamacare. I understand you've got some problem you've got with this legislation, but it's decision time. Are you going to be responsible for defying me, hurting my presidency, and keeping Obamacare on the books? I don't think that those 40 stay 40.
Right, he's still got political power. Ed, I want to ask you quickly about the president or the White House had a little feint towards immigration reform. The day of the speech, there was a little notion that the president might support permanent legal status, have a job, pay your taxes, you won't have to worry about getting deported. What did you make of that?
Twice in February, he had private lunches with people where he raised this issue. Repeatedly in public, he hasn't brought it up. So one wonders really what is his stated goal here. You know, all he really talked about was that immigration victims, crime victims office, which is not going to be a very busy office, frankly, because there are isolated and very high-profile examples of this, but it's not widespread. What is widespread and what's causing a lot of trouble and concern for people right now is the really uneven enforcement of the immigration laws. The Congressional Hispanic Caucus, to their credit, has done a good job tracking this. And the examples of a 22-year-old who was arrested by ICE after speaking out at a press conference about them is being sent back to Mexico. A mother who was checking in with ICE for years being sent back to Mexico for the same reason.
In other words, it's not just the bad
and it's happening
dudes,
all over the country. It's not the bad hombres.
Right.
These are good hombres in many cases. No criminal record at all. And the confusion that this is causing with very little congressional oversight, while the president's talking about the idea of doing it and people are waiting for him to signal what they want to do, is just incredible and causing great confusion.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you, and we'll be back in a moment.